It was a normal day at the airport. People were rushing around, trying to catch their flights. Some were carrying heavy bags, while others were busy chatting with friends or staring at the big flight boards, waiting to see when their flight would be called. The sound of announcements echoed through the airport. Attention, passengers of Flight 182, please proceed to Gate 4. Michael Johnson was just another traveler among the crowd. He was standing in line, holding his ticket in one hand and his carry-on bag in the other. Like everyone else, he was excited to board his flight. He had a big trip ahead, and he was looking forward to reaching his destination. But little did he know, today was going to be different. Today was going to be a day that changed everything. You see, Michael had been flying for years. He'd taken countless flights, sat in hundreds of seats, and never once had anything go wrong. But today, as he walked toward the gate for his flight, he had no idea that he was about to face something that would shake him to his core. Something that would make him question how people could treat one another so unfairly. Before we get deeper into Michael's story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from today? And if you enjoy hearing stories like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future stories like it. I promise, you don't want to miss out. Now back to Michael. Michael was just like anyone else. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't someone with a lot of attention or influence. He was simply a man trying to get from point A to point B like so many others in the airport. He bought his ticket, made sure he was on time, and was ready to board. But when he reached the counter to check in for his flight, something strange happened. It all started with a simple mistake. It wasn't even a big deal at first. Michael had been assigned to a seat on the plane, just like every other passenger. But when he arrived at his seat, a flight attendant named Sarah told him that he couldn't sit there. The seat was reserved for someone else, she said. Michael was a little confused, but he didn't argue. After all, mistakes happen, right? He was just trying to get to his seat, so he could relax and enjoy the flight. So, he politely asked if there was another seat available. But Sarah didn't respond with the kindness that Michael expected. Instead, she gave him a cold, almost dismissive look. You need to sit in another seat. Now, she said, pointing to an empty row a few rows behind. Michael was confused. Why was she being so rude? He had done nothing wrong. It was just a simple seat mix-up. But the tone of her voice made it clear that she wasn't interested in making things right. She just wanted to get him to sit down and out of her way. At first, Michael thought maybe she was just having a bad day. Everyone has them, right? But as the flight attendant turned her back and walked away, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He didn't understand why Sarah was treating him like this. He had been polite, calm, and respectful. Why wasn't she responding the same way? As he walked to the new seat she had assigned him, Michael noticed a few other things. The passengers around him didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. They were all too busy with their own thoughts. But Michael couldn't ignore what was happening. He sat down in the new seat, trying to relax, but he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's attitude. It didn't make sense. It wasn't just the seat assignment. It was the way she had spoken to him, the way she had treated him like he didn't matter. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a mistake. There was something more to it. He thought about it for a few moments. Could it be because of the color of his skin? Was that the reason she had treated him this way? Michael had experienced prejudice before, but never quite like this. He had faced situations where people had looked at him funny or treated him differently, but this felt more personal. The coldness in Sarah's voice and the way she pointed at him had felt sharp. Michael didn't know for sure, but he couldn't shake the thought. The flight started boarding, and everyone around him was getting settled into their seats. Michael noticed that the other flight attendants were friendly and smiling as they greeted the passengers. But not Sarah. She was still walking around, looking at people with that same cold, distant look in her eyes. A few minutes later, Michael saw Sarah walking down the aisle again. This time, she was talking to another flight attendant, and Michael overheard bits of their conversation. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then he caught a few words that made his stomach drop. Sarah was talking about him. You know, I can't stand how some people just don't know their place, Sarah said quietly, but Michael could hear her perfectly. The words hit him like a punch in the gut. Michael felt his face flush with anger and confusion. What did she mean by that? Was she talking about him? Was she saying that he didn't belong in the seat he had been given, or worse, that he didn't belong on the plane at all? He couldn't believe it. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been treated unfairly, No, he had been treated badly, just because of the color of his skin. Sarah had assumed that because he was black, he didn't deserve the same respect or kindness as the other passengers. Michael felt his blood begin to boil. He had been wronged. He had been mistreated. But the worst part? Nobody else seemed to notice. The other passengers were too busy with their own thoughts to pay attention. They didn't see what was happening, and if they did, they didn't care. Michael couldn't just sit there and let this go. He knew he had to do something. He thought about what he should do next. Should he say something to Sarah? Should he report her to the airline? But what if that just made things worse? What if no one believed him? Michael felt alone. He felt powerless. But as he sat there in his seat, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let Sarah get away with treating him like this. He had been quiet for too long, letting things slide because it was easier. But today, something inside him clicked. He wasn't going to be quiet anymore. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about respect. It was about standing up for what's right. And Michael was about to find out that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just change the way people see you. It can change everything. Have you ever been treated unfairly in a situation where you felt powerless? What did you do about it? Michael had always been the kind of person who liked to keep to himself. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, and he didn't seek attention. Michael preferred to stay quiet, do his job, and go about his life. He didn't like to stir up trouble, and he never wanted to make things awkward. But sometimes, it felt like people were always looking at him differently. He could feel it, even when they didn't say anything. It was like an invisible weight sitting on his shoulders. He knew that people judged him by the color of his skin. He had seen it in their eyes, heard it in their voices. Sometimes people would give him looks that made him feel like he didn't belong, like he was different from the rest. It wasn't something that happened every day, but it happened enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. He had learned to live with it, even though it was hard. He told himself that it wasn't his fault, that he shouldn't let it bother him. But there were days when it felt like the weight was too much to carry. Today was one of those days. Michael had been traveling for a while now. He had taken many flights, gone through many airports. Most of the time, he didn't think much about it. It was just part of life. But today, something felt different. He didn't know what it was at first, but as soon as he stepped onto the plane, he felt it in the air. The plane was crowded. Passengers were finding their seats. The flight attendants were walking up and down the aisles, and the sound of people talking filled the cabin. But in the midst of it all, Michael felt a strange sense of tension. It wasn't the usual hustle and bustle of the airport. It was something more, something uncomfortable. Michael made his way down the aisle to his seat. He had been assigned seat 22B, and he was looking forward to sitting down and relaxing before the flight took off. But as he approached his seat, he noticed a flight attendant standing by it. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't welcoming. In fact, she looked almost irritated. The flight attendant looked up at Michael for just a moment, but she didn't make eye contact. She quickly handed him his boarding pass and said in a sharp voice, "Sorry, sir, but you'll have to take another seat." Michael blinked in surprise. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just following the boarding instructions. He was at his seat, ready to sit down. But now, this flight attendant was telling him to move. He didn't understand. "Excuse me?" Michael asked, a little confused. "I think this is my seat." The flight attendant didn't even glance at the seat number. She just waved her hand dismissively and said again, "You'll have to take another seat. This one's taken." Michael felt his stomach twist. He wasn't sure what was going on. He looked around, hoping for some explanation, but the other passengers didn't seem to notice anything unusual. Everyone was busy getting settled in their seats, buckling their seatbelts and preparing for the flight. It was as if Michael was the only one who felt the strange tension in the air. He tried to stay calm. Maybe there was some sort of mistake. But as the flight attendant turned and walked away without another word, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She hadn't even apologized. She hadn't explained why he couldn't sit in the seat he had been assigned. It was like she didn't care at all. Michael's mind raced. Could it be that she was just having a bad day? Maybe she was stressed or annoyed with her job. He tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but a small voice inside his head was starting to tell him something he didn't want to hear. What if it wasn't just a mistake? What if there was something more to it? What if this wasn't about the seat at all? Michael had faced this kind of thing before. It wasn't the first time he had felt like people treated him differently because of the color of his skin. Sometimes it was subtle, a look here, a comment there. Other times it was more obvious. But this felt different. This felt like something deeper, something intentional. He took a deep breath and tried to push the thought out of his mind. It didn't matter. He was just here to take the flight. He wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. He could sit in another seat, no problem. It was just a small inconvenience, right? But as he walked to the new seat that the flight attendant had pointed to, Michael couldn't help but feel uneasy. The new seat wasn't far from the first one, but it was still a little further away from the window. Michael liked sitting by the window. It helped him feel calm, and he liked to look out at the clouds during the flight. But now, as he sat down in the new seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced back at the flight attendant, but she was already walking down the aisle, talking to another passenger. She didn't even look in his direction again. Michael felt a strange mixture of frustration and confusion. Why had she treated him like that? What had he done to deserve it? The plane began to fill up with people, and the sound of chatter grew louder. People were still getting settled in their seats, making small talk, and preparing for takeoff. But Michael couldn't focus on any of it. He kept thinking about the way the flight attendant had looked at him, the way she had spoken to him. Something about her attitude felt different. It wasn't just that she had asked him to move. It was the way she had dismissed him so easily. It was as if she didn't care about him at all, as if he didn't matter. Michael felt his heart start to race. Maybe it was just in his head, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt like something wasn't right. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. He wasn't sure if they noticed what had happened, but he felt like they were looking at him differently. It was like they were all watching, waiting to see what he would do. And then he overheard something that made his stomach turn. As he sat in his new seat, trying to calm himself, he heard the flight attendant talking to another worker. Michael couldn't hear every word, but he heard enough to understand. "You'd think they would know their place," she said quietly, almost under her breath. "But they don't." Michael froze. His heart stopped. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. He had heard it before, but hearing it again, so openly, so casually, it hit him harder than he expected. His hands tightened around the armrests of his seat. He could feel the anger starting to bubble up inside him, but he tried to stay calm. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to cause trouble. But how could he just ignore what he had heard? How could he pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't? Michael's mind raced. He wanted to say something. He wanted to stand up and confront the flight attendant. But what good would that do? Would anyone believe him? Would they just think he was making things up? He didn't want to be the angry passenger who caused problems. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't just let it go. He had to do something. He couldn't let people treat him this way. Not anymore. It wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't even just about the way the flight attendant had spoken to him. It was about something much bigger, something that had been building up inside him for a long time. It was about respect. It was about dignity. And it was about standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it was. Michael's heart was pounding now. He knew he had to make a choice. He could either stay silent, let it slide and go about his day, or he could take a stand. The decision was clear. As Michael settled into his new seat, he couldn't shake the strange feeling gnawing at him. The moment he sat down, he noticed Sarah walking past him again. This time, her eyes didn't just glance at him. They lingered, and it was clear that she was watching him. It was like he had done something wrong, even though he was just sitting in his seat like everyone else. Why was she looking at him like that? His heart was still pounding, and he felt uneasy. Michael tried to ignore it, telling himself that he was probably overthinking things. After all, it was just a seat change, right? Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe it wasn't about him at all. But as Sarah walked by, her eyes scanned the room, quickly darting from person to person. It was like she was checking something, making sure everyone was settled. But then, for just a second, her gaze stopped on him again. Michael felt his stomach tighten. It was as if she was keeping an eye on him, like he was somehow the only person who mattered in her line of sight. What was going on? Why was she so focused on him? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a gentle voice coming from the front of the plane. The flight attendants were still preparing for takeoff, making sure everyone was seated properly. But Michael couldn't help but feel like the air was heavier than usual. There was something unspoken between Sarah and him. He could feel it in the way she walked past him, the way she glanced at him, and the way her colleagues seemed to look at him as well. Minutes ticked by, but the feeling didn't go away. Michael started to feel like there was more to this than just a simple seat change. There was something else, something deeper. Then, As the plane filled up with more passengers, Michael overheard a quiet conversation between Sarah and one of the other flight attendants. They were standing near the front of the plane, and their voices were soft, but Michael could hear every word. "You'd think they'd know their place by now," Sarah whispered just loud enough for Michael to hear. His blood ran cold. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Michael froze in his seat, staring straight ahead, not daring to move. His mind raced. What had she just said? Was she talking about him? He wanted to turn around, to confront her, but he knew he couldn't. If he did, it would just make things worse. People would stare. They'd think he was making a scene. He had heard people say things like that before. He had heard whispers, seen the looks, felt the uncomfortable tension in the air. But hearing it out loud from someone who was supposed to be taking care of him on the plane, it made his stomach turn. He glanced around the plane, his eyes searching the other passengers. Nobody seemed to have noticed the conversation. They were all too busy with their own things. The people sitting near him were chatting, looking at their phones, or staring out the windows. Nobody was paying attention to what was happening in the front of the plane. But Michael couldn't forget what he had heard. They'd know their place by now. He tried to push the thought out of his mind, but it kept coming back. What did she mean by that? Was she talking about him because he was black? Had she been treating him like that all along because of his skin color? Michael clenched his fists, his palms growing sweaty. He had never been the type of person to make waves. He didn't like confrontation. He just wanted to get through the flight without any problems. But now he couldn't just let it go. He couldn't pretend like nothing was wrong. Not after hearing what Sarah had said. His heart raced again. He tried to calm himself, to think rationally. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she didn't mean what he thought she meant. But deep down, Michael knew better. He had experienced this kind of thing before. The subtle racism. The way people sometimes treated him like he didn't belong. And it hurt. It hurt more than he wanted to admit. Michael shifted in his seat, feeling the pressure of the situation growing. He looked out the window, but all he could see were the clouds stretching out below him. The world outside the plane seemed so far away, but inside, the tension was thick. He could feel the anger building inside him, but he didn't know what to do with it. He wasn't the kind of person to cause a scene. He wasn't the kind of person to make a big deal out of things. But this was different. This wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't just about a flight attendant being rude. It was about something much bigger. It was about respect. It was about dignity. Michael took a deep breath. He had to stay calm. He couldn't let his emotions take over. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't stay silent anymore. He couldn't just sit there and pretend like nothing was wrong. Not when he had overheard those words. He glanced up at Sarah, who was still walking down the aisle, checking on the passengers. She looked so calm, so collected, as if nothing had happened. As if everything was fine. But Michael knew the truth. He knew that something was wrong. He had to do something. But what? The rest of the flight felt like it dragged on forever. Michael's mind raced with questions. What could he do? Should he speak up? Should he report Sarah? But what if they didn't believe him? What if no one took him seriously? He had heard stories about people being dismissed, about people's complaints being ignored. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just him. This wasn't just about a rude flight attendant. This was about standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it was. He couldn't let Sarah's words slide. Not this time. As the plane continued its journey, Michael felt a sense of determination start to grow inside him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that he couldn't let this go. He wasn't going to let Sarah or anyone else make him feel like he didn't belong. He wasn't going to let them treat him like he was less than anyone else. Michael had been through a lot in his life, and he had learned a lot about himself. He had learned to keep his head down, to stay quiet, and to avoid conflict. But he also knew that sometimes staying silent wasn't the answer. Sometimes you had to speak up. You had to make your voice heard, even if it was scary. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Sarah or anyone else make him feel small. The plane was just about ready to leave. The engines were starting to hum, and the last few people were being settled into their seats. The flight attendants were double-checking everything. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. This was the moment he couldn't ignore anymore. The doors of the plane were just about to close, and Michael felt a wave of nervousness. But something inside him pushed him to stand up. He knew he couldn't just sit back and let this slide. Not today. Not after everything that had happened. With a deep breath, He stood up, trying not to draw too much attention to himself. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept his posture straight. He was determined. He wasn't going to back down. As he walked down the aisle toward the front of the plane, he noticed Sarah wasn't paying much attention to him. She was busy helping other passengers, making sure everyone had their seatbelts on and their tray tables up. But Michael wasn't just any passenger today. Today, he was going to make sure Sarah saw him, saw who he really was. He walked past rows of seats, the hum of the engines growing louder as the plane was about to take off. His eyes were focused ahead. He had a goal, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him. When he reached the front of the plane, he paused for a moment. The cockpit door was closed, and the flight attendants were doing their final checks. Michael took a deep breath and then approached one of the attendants. He felt his palms getting a little sweaty, but he tried to stay calm. "Excuse me," Michael said in a clear, steady voice. He didn't raise it too much, but his words were firm. "Is the captain on board?" The flight attendant looked at him with a curious expression, but didn't ask any questions. She opened the door to the cockpit, and Michael stepped inside. And there, standing by the cockpit, was the captain, a man in his mid-40s with a calm expression and neatly pressed uniform. The captain looked at Michael, his eyes a little surprised. Michael stepped closer to the captain, feeling his heart race. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he had to do this. He had to make sure that Sarah's behavior didn't go unnoticed. "I'm Michael Johnson," he said quietly, leaning in so the captain could hear. "I need to tell you something important." The captain nodded, signaling for Michael to continue. Michael could feel all the eyes on him, but he didn't care. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to back down. In a low voice, Michael whispered something into the captain's ear. The captain's expression shifted, and for the first time, Michael saw a flicker of surprise. The captain straightened up and gave Michael a look that made him feel like he had made the right choice. The captain turned toward the door, about to leave the cockpit, but then he paused and looked back at Michael. He nodded once more. "Thank you for telling me," the captain said, his voice serious. "I'll take care of it." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He had done it. He had spoken up. And now, it was up to the captain to make sure the situation was handled. As Michael made his way back to his seat, he couldn't help but notice that Sarah was looking at him now. This time, her eyes weren't just glancing over him like before. No, this time, Sarah's gaze was full of tension. Her eyes flickered with something that looked like anger, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. She couldn't hide the discomfort in her posture. It was clear that something had shifted. Michael sat down, trying to keep his cool. His heart was still beating fast, but now, he felt a small sense of pride. He had stood up for himself, and now, he was about to see what would happen next. As the plane continued its journey, Michael could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. Something bigger had happened. Something that would change how everyone on the plane viewed the situation. A few minutes later, the announcement came. The captain's voice echoed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, "I regret to inform you that due to some concerns regarding a seating arrangement, one of our flight attendants, Sarah Stevens, will no longer be able to continue her duties for the remainder of this flight." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had known something would happen, but hearing the captain speak it out loud made everything real. There was a pause before the captain continued. "We take matters of fairness and respect very seriously on this airline. We want to make sure that all of our passengers are treated with kindness and equality. We are addressing the issue, and we want to ensure that everyone on this flight has a safe and comfortable experience." The rest of the passengers looked around, some of them whispering to each other. Michael could see the surprise on their faces, and he knew they were wondering what had just happened. Sarah, meanwhile, had gone completely pale. She didn't speak. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. She just stood there, frozen, as the other flight attendants took over her duties. It wasn't long before a member of the airline security team walked up to Sarah. Michael watched as they spoke quietly for a moment, then motioned for her to leave. Sarah's face was flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't resist. She didn't even argue. She just walked out of the cabin, her head lowered. Michael sat back in his seat, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt bad for Sarah. He didn't want to see anyone lose their job, but he also knew that she had crossed the line. Her treatment of him had been wrong, and now She had to face the consequences of her actions. The rest of the flight was quiet, but Michael knew things would never be the same. He had spoken up, he had made sure that his voice was heard, and in the end, justice had been served. As the plane made its descent toward its destination, Michael looked out the window, his thoughts calm and clear. He had faced a difficult situation, but he had handled it with dignity, and that was something he could be proud of. In that moment, Michael realized that standing up for yourself wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Even if the world tried to keep you quiet, you had to speak your truth. Sometimes that was all you could do, and sometimes it made all the difference. As Sarah was escorted off the plane by security, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. Michael couldn't help but feel a huge sense of relief, but at the same time his heart still raced. The whole situation had unfolded so quickly, and now it was over. Or, at least, it seemed like it was. But Michael knew something important had happened. He had stood up for himself. He had done something when most people might have stayed quiet. And he wasn't just feeling relief because the flight was about to continue. He was feeling proud. Proud because he had taken action when it mattered most. Sarah had been so sure of herself. She had walked through the plane with her head held high, thinking she could get away with treating Michael poorly. But now, she was being escorted off the plane by two security officers, her face red with embarrassment. The power had shifted, and it felt good to Michael. Not because Sarah had been fired, but because the injustice he had experienced had been acknowledged. As she was led down the aisle, Michael noticed that the other passengers were watching her leave. Their eyes followed her every move, and there was an air of shock and disbelief. Everyone had seen the way Sarah had treated him earlier, and now they were seeing her escorted off the plane in front of them. Michael could feel their eyes on him, too. Some looked at him with curiosity, while others looked at him with respect. But the real change had already happened. Michael had done what he needed to do. The plane was now quiet, with only the soft hum of the engines breaking the stillness. The flight attendants continued with their jobs, but there was a difference in the way they moved now. They were more careful, more aware of their actions. They couldn't ignore what had just happened. The captain's announcement came over the speakers again, but this time, the words seemed heavier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we want to assure you that we take all matters of passenger treatment seriously. We regret the actions of one of our crew members earlier today. However, we are committed to providing a safe and respectful environment for all our passengers." Michael listened closely, his heart still racing a little. The captain's voice didn't sound angry, but it carried an authority that made it clear that this situation was not being brushed aside. It was being taken seriously. As the announcement ended, a few people began to whisper to each other. The plane was still in motion, but there was an air of curiosity. Passengers who had witnessed the event began talking about what had happened. They didn't know the full story, but they had seen enough to understand that something had gone wrong. Some of them looked at Michael and smiled. Others gave him a nod of acknowledgement. Michael didn't know exactly what they were thinking, but he could tell they were starting to see him differently. Before, he had been just another passenger, a guy sitting quietly in his seat, trying to get through a long flight. Now he was someone who had taken a stand. The plane flew on, the sky outside turning from blue to the soft orange and purple of sunset. The cabin was calmer now. The tension from earlier had faded, but Michael's mind was still spinning. He thought about the way Sarah had treated him and how, for so long, he had stayed quiet about it. It had taken everything inside him to stand up, to walk to the front of the plane and make his voice heard. And now, because of his courage, things were different. The rest of the flight went by without any more drama. Michael felt like he could finally relax. The crew members went about their duties. The other passengers settled into their own worlds, and the soft click of seatbelt signs and overhead bins filled the cabin. Michael had done what was right, and now he could sit back and enjoy the rest of the journey. But the biggest part of the story had already been written. Michael had shown the world, or at least the people on that plane, that sometimes standing up for yourself isn't about shouting or fighting. Sometimes, it's about having the courage to speak the truth, even when it's difficult. As the plane made its final descent toward its destination, Michael looked out the window. The sun was almost gone now, leaving the sky filled with soft colors. It was a peaceful moment, and Michael couldn't help but reflect on everything that had just happened. He had faced a tough situation, but now he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. He had made a difference, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The message was clear. When you stand up for what's right, no matter how small or big the moment is, change happens. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time to let everyone know they were getting ready to land. "Thank you for flying with us," the captain said, sounding as friendly as before. "We hope you have a pleasant stay, and remember, kindness and respect make all the difference." The plane touched down gently, and Michael could hear the faint applause from the passengers. It was a small thing, but it felt significant to him. He had done the right thing. He had spoken up when he needed to, and now things had been set right. The flight attendants began to prepare for everyone to leave the plane, and Michael stood up, gathering his things. He glanced around at the other passengers, and this time, he wasn't just a quiet traveler. He was someone who had made a stand, someone who had shown that justice could be served, even on an ordinary plane ride. As he walked out of the plane, he noticed the crew members were looking at him with a new respect. They had seen what had happened, and though they may not have understood everything, they knew one thing for sure. Michael had stood up for what was right. He didn't know what the next part of his journey would be, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't about what had happened today. It was about what he had learned. He had learned that when you face injustice, you have the power to change things. You don't need to be the loudest or the strongest person in the room. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to stand up, speak out, and make a difference. And with that thought in mind, Michael walked off the plane, feeling like he had taken a giant step forward, not just in his journey, but in his life. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where everything seems unfair. The world feels heavy, and people look at us like we don't belong. But here's the thing. Those moments, the ones when we feel small or invisible, are often the ones that shape us the most. They're the moments when we can show who we really are. Just like Michael, he wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't looking for trouble. But when things went wrong, when people tried to treat him unfairly, he stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back with anger. Instead, Michael used something far more powerful, his truth. Truth is a funny thing. It doesn't need to scream or shout to be heard. Sometimes it only takes one small voice to make a big change. And that's exactly what Michael did. He didn't let the way Sarah treated him slide. Instead of just letting it go, he stood up, told the truth, and let that truth do its work. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. We all have moments where we feel like no one is listening, like the world is against us. It could be a small thing, like being left out at school or ignored at work, or a bigger thing, like being treated unfairly just because of who we are. In those moments, it's easy to think there's nothing we can do. But Michael's story teaches us something important. We all have the power to change things. Michael didn't change things by being angry or by fighting. He changed things by simply being true to himself. And that's a lesson we can all learn from. When you face a situation where things don't feel right, you don't have to be the loudest or the strongest. You just have to be real. You just have to tell the truth, even if it feels scary. It's not always easy. Standing up for yourself can feel like standing alone sometimes. You might worry that people won't understand or that you'll be seen as weak. But the truth is, standing up for yourself takes more strength than any fight. It takes the courage to say, "This is wrong," even when no one else does. It takes the belief that you deserve respect, and that belief is powerful. When Sarah treated Michael unfairly, she thought she could get away with it. She thought he wouldn't say anything, that he would just sit quietly and take it. But Michael proved her wrong. And not just Sarah, he proved everyone who has ever felt like they were in a situation where they didn't matter. He showed them that they do matter, that their voices are important. The truth has a way of changing things. It might not always happen right away. It might not always be easy. But when you stand up and speak the truth, it creates ripples. It inspires others to do the same. And slowly, the world around you begins to change. In a small way, Michael changed that plane. He changed the way people thought about him and the way they thought about standing up for what's right. The other passengers, the flight attendants, even Sarah, everyone saw something different that day. They saw a person who wouldn't be silenced. And they learned that sometimes the people who try to silence us are the ones who need to learn the most. But Michael's story didn't end there. It didn't just change the plane ride. It could change the way we all look at the world. It can remind us that we have the power to make things better, even when they seem hard. We have the power to stand tall, to speak the truth, and to make the world more just. Next time you feel like the odds are stacked against you, remember Michael. Remember that he didn't need to be the loudest or the toughest. He just needed to be true to himself. And when you do that, when you find the courage to speak the truth, no matter what, you'll see the difference it can make. Maybe you're dealing with a situation at school or in your life right now that doesn't feel fair. Maybe you feel like no one is listening. But remember, you have something powerful inside you, your voice, your truth, and it can make a change just like Michael's did. So, what do you think? Was Michael right to take a stand? Or could he have handled it differently? What would you do in his place? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And don't forget to hit subscribe for more stories that make you think, stories that inspire you to take action and be the change you want to see in the world.